Good morning and welcome to the second and last day of the U.S. EPA Brownfields Grant Writing Strategies Workshop for Indiana. I'm Roxanne Anderson, the KSU Technical Assistance to Brownfields Regional Director for U.S. EPA Region 5. Joined again today by John Morris from the Indiana Brownfields Program, Matt Didier with U.S. EPA Region 5, Stephen Ray with the North Central Indiana Regional Planning Commission, and Len Henricks with BCA Environmental Consultants. Riley Jenkins from the U.S. EPA will be presenting today as well on EJ Screen and CGES, and we also have part of our Region 5 KSU TAB team, Beth Grigsby, and KSU TAB partner, Amy Yersovich. We're all thrilled to have you joining us, and we've got an exciting morning lined up for you. Dana, if you want to share the slides. Got it up. Okay, so next, I do have a few quick points to go over. Again, before we get started, if you have technical difficulties with your connection, please call 785-200-7005 or email chsr@ksu.edu, and someone should be able to assist you. We are recording this workshop today, and the recording along with the presentation slides will be available on the KSU TAB website where you registered for this event within the next few days. That link will be shared again in the chat box. Next. Just a few quick reminders to ensure a pleasant experience for everyone involved. All participants should be muted, but please double check to ensure your microphone is muted throughout the workshop. If you're using your phone for audio, please make sure your computer audio is also muted in addition to your phone. This reduces the chance of static and feedback for everybody involved. Also, please make sure your video remains off during the presentation. To make sure we're able to verify your attendance, please change your participant name to match the name of the one that you registered with if it's not already the same. You can do this by clicking on the participants icon on the Zoom toolbar. When the list of participants comes up, just locate yourself, click on the More button, and select Rename. A new box will appear asking you to enter a new screen name. We would also like for this to be as interactive as possible. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the event today, and you can do so by using the chat feature also located in the Zoom toolbar. Next. We went over this briefly yesterday, but for those of you who are not familiar with KSU TAB, we are one of 6 technical assistance programs in the United States funded by a US EPA grant. The TAB service providers provide free services that are tailored to specific needs in planning, economic development, and environmental challenges. Kansas State University covers US EPA regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. Next. One of the free services that KSU TAB provides are educational webinars and workshops that help communities with various challenges like the one today focusing on grant writing. It's extremely important to us to hear from participants so we can continuously improve and keep our content relevant. At the end of today's event, please take some time to fill out a brief survey about your experience. You can utilize the link or the QR code here and pull it up now so you don't forget. Next. If you do not have a copy of today's agenda, it can be found on the registration site. I also believe that it's in the chat box. We have a full day starting off with John Morris and the fabulous Riley Jenkins, who will go over needed data gathering tools, and rounding out the day with a group exercise again that will give you the opportunity to see how grants are scored in Section 3 of the grant guidelines. Next. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to our first speaker of the day, John Morris, Stakeholder Engagement Coordinator with the Indiana Brownfields Program.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Roxanne. My name's John Morris. I'm with Stakeholder Engagement Coordinator with the Indiana Brownfields Program. I just wanted to at least highlight some of the things we do for people, as well as talk about some of our funding sources outside of our EPA grants that you may receive. Next slide, please. I guess we got 2 intros. Go ahead and knock the next one out too. I did highlight this yesterday, but I at least wanted to share everyone, I guess, our mission statement and what we're really trying to do here is to encourage investment and redevelopment of blighted properties within communities. We do educational, financial, technical, and legal assistance to provide that service to all of our communities in 92 counties. But we're trying to obviously prevent repair sites like this gas station here in this picture from turning into this condition. Next slide, please. I know we've highlighted this before, but this is our state definition of what is a brownfield in case people do have that concern. I mean, we need to have, obviously, our sites go through eligibility reviews and process with EPA. So I do highlight this usually to people just to ensure that when we come and talk about projects and sites, that they potentially would qualify as an eligible site for brownfields. And if you're not sure, if you have one in your community, please ask. We'd be happy to evaluate the parcel, take a look at it and see if it does qualify for further evaluation. Next slide, please. We do highlight to people here in the state of Indiana that we are a free governmental assistance. Some programs throughout the state do charge fees for services related to coordination with brownfields for redevelopment. We are voluntary as well, so we do not have an enforcement component to our group. We are all voluntary and working with everyone. More of a collaborative process, so it's a little bit different than maybe you have a different experience with regulators at IDEM. We do use their science services and the risk-based closure guide, so we do work kind of in concert with IDEM on our projects to ensure that we're being safe for human health and environment with our reuse. Next slide, please. And as some of our ways we can help communities, we do have our own grants and subawards we can issue and work with communities on eligible projects. We do have a team of about 10 project managers where we work on comfort letters and manage a project through some of our remedial programs that we work on. We do education and outreach and also write comfort letters for our legal assistance. And our site status letters, which are kind of our closure letters. It highlights our enforcement discretion, some of our determinations. Next slide, please. If you do come across a project that might be outside of a scope of maybe, say, you have an assessment grant and are needing remediation funding, we might have that ability to talk to you. So we have the Petroleum Orphan Site Initiative. We have a fact sheet on our webpage. So we may be able to assist concurrently on a project that you may have funding with. We will also have a phase one initiative. We set aside about $75,000 per year to knock out maybe 35 phase ones. So what we normally have is communities come and apply for that phase one assistance directly to us on behalf of a prospective purchaser, and we can help facilitate payment of a phase one. It's kind of a first come, first served basis with a lot of these programs, especially with our 128A current funding, with our bipartisan infrastructure law money. We do have, I think, a lot of our projects kind of in the pipeline. Some of our funds are currently committed, but we do are accepting, I guess, other applications, and we might be able to assist here in the future with funding, maybe in the fall. But at least wanted to point out that we do have this component of maybe assisting on a project as well as with your funding source or your potential grant. So obviously, please let us know, and communication, I guess, is the key. We can assist and try to keep the project moving to completion for you as well. So just something to consider. And if you have any additional follow-up questions, please let me know. Next slide, please. We have touched over the 92 counties around a little over 2,500 projects. We consider maybe 300 or a little almost 400 sites active right now, where we're actually having a project manager work on a document or help write a comfort letter. We were initially funded back in the late 90s with the Hazardous Substance Trust Fund, and we got a little bit of money from IDEM as well with the Excess Liability Trust Fund. And then we do receive biennial state funding. Right now it's up to $8 million, so about $4 million a year from ELF, primarily funding our POSI projects. Next slide. Looks like there's a question for John. What's timing for comfort letter once submitted to Indiana Brownfields program? It's usually 60 to 90 days. We tell people 120. So this is something to be mindful of. It really depends on, I guess, our workload and our volume, but it does take a couple months for us to evaluate and knock out the letter in ERC. So it's something, if you do have a component where your phase one's becoming stale, it's something to be mindful of whether or not we just resubmit with a phase one update. We've seen where people submit and give us a week where the report unfortunately is expired or needs an update. So we try to have that outreach with people, not to expect, I guess, a comfort letter within a day when we have submittals. But 90 days, I think, is what we normally see, and we can either address that as a prospective purchaser or as owner. So we tend to review the submittals from a legal standpoint just to ensure that the phase one is viable. So we've had people come through and buy the property after our initial review, and then we just address the letter to them as an owner. So getting back to our slide, I at least wanted to highlight something that we're pretty proud of here in Brownfields. Last year, we hit a funding milestone of 100 million. The highlight here on this slide is a total federal awards versus state awards that we received ourselves and what we've helped on our projects. Next slide, please. Another highlight of some of the things we've done with some of the investments we've had since November of 2009. I think the phase one updates are a little outdated. We've done several of these here recently over the past few months, but again, we've done 161 petroleum sites in 103 communities. We've spent almost 33 million getting tanks out of the ground. Next slide. I believe that would be it for me. So I'd be happy to talk follow-up questions with people after this presentation, or if you have any additional questions, please let me know. But we might have funding resources available for you in concert with your EPA grant. So just keep this in mind. I'll turn it back over to Riley Jenkins, please. Or Roxanne.
All right. I think I'm going to steal the screen because I have some demo to do with this presentation. All right, can somebody just give me a thumbs up if that's popping up for you? Yes.
It shows a black screen right now. It doesn't seem to show.
It says double click to enter full screen mode.
One second.
There you go. But you are muted now.
Thank you. Sorry for all the technical issues. My name is Riley Jenkins. I am a Brownfields project manager in Region 5. And I am just here to give you an overview of how you can use two online web mapping tools, CGIST and EJ Screen, to strengthen your applications for EPA Brownfields grants. So the first thing we'll go over is how Brownfields grants make environmental justice a priority. I'll discuss the basics of the CGIST tool, and then we'll do a quick walkthrough. We will repeat that for EJ Screen. We can talk about the differences between the two of them very briefly. And then with our new knowledge about these tools, we'll evaluate some application responses as a test run. And I can answer questions at the end. I hope to save enough time for that, but we do have a lot to get through with these two tools. So if I can't get everything answered, my contact information is at the end of these slides. And I'm going to turn my camera off so that I don't run out of bandwidth here. Okay. So a critical part of EPA's Brownfields program is ensuring that residents living in communities historically affected by economic disinvestment, health disparities, and environmental contamination all have the opportunity to benefit from brownfields redevelopment, as do the communities that are a little bit more prepared to apply for our grants. So this language is directly from last year's grant competition guidelines. We're defining EJ screen or EJ in line with the EPA as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Also from the guidelines last year, applicants should provide specific examples of how the proposed Brownfields grant project will address environmental justice challenges in Section 5E or 4E, and responses will be evaluated against the criteria in Section 5A. So the information that you'll get from these two tools will support the community need and engagement section of the application. And in addition to the environmental justice questions in there, there are also prompts about sensitive populations, health and welfare, disease, etc. And those responses can be strengthened with the data that we're going to look at here too. So like I said, the community needs section is what we are going to be able to address with these tools. For 5 points, first, you'll be asked to explain how funding would meet the needs of the communities and explain how that they cannot source other initial funding for environmental assessment, remediation, reuse, etc. in the target areas because the community has a small population and or is low income. If you don't answer this question, or you're applying for a target area that does not apply to this description, you can get a maximum of 2 points here. Also for 5 points, identify the sensitive populations within the target areas, the severity of the health or welfare issues experienced, and how this grant will address those or facilitate the identification and reduction of threats to the health or welfare of such groups. Finally, also for 5 points, explain how funding would address or facilitate, address or facilitate the identification and reduction of threats to population in target areas suffering greater than normal incidence of diseases or conditions possibly associated with exposure to hazardous substances, pollutants, contaminants, or petroleum. Again, a maximum of 2 points here if you do not answer this question or do not address these issues, or do not have a community in your target area that fits this description. Specifically for environmental justice, there are 2 questions. First, you'll be asked to describe the environmental justice issues and how they affect underserved communities or disadvantaged census tracts in the target area. Then you'll be asked to discuss how funding would advance environmental justice and minimize displacement among the underserved communities in the target area. These directions that I all just went through are paraphrased, but I know that part of this workshop is reviewing application guidelines, so you all have access to the FY24 guidelines that you can look at if you want to go into further detail and see exactly how it's written. So please note that all applicants must indicate whether their chosen sites are located within a CGIS disadvantaged census tract, which we will discuss how to find in just a moment. And that is a requirement with the exception for tribes or eligible tribal entities. And again, if you don't have a CGIS disadvantaged census tract within your target area, it's a maximum of 2 points. And I recommend that you actually state the words CGIS disadvantaged community or CGIS disadvantaged census tract in your application, because reviewers are only looking at the information you are presenting to them. They won't be checking the tools on the back end for you, so it's best to be very, very clear. And points are awarded based on the extent and quality of your response. So first we'll look at CGIS. As stated in the FY24 grant guidelines, applicants are encouraged to use CGIS to identify whether their priority sites are within a disadvantaged census tract for purposes of Justice 40. CGIS stands for the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. It was established as part of the Justice 40 Initiative, which was a component of a 2021 executive order, which declared that 40% of overall benefits of certain climate, clean energy, et cetera, investments go towards disadvantaged communities that are marginalized by underinvestment and overburdened by pollution. CGIST is an interactive map with data sets intended to be used to identify any communities meeting that Justice 40 criteria you see on the slide. And there are 8 indicators of burden, or you can think about them as categories, used to break down the criteria that we'll look at in a moment. And the data in CGIST comes from publicly available, nationally consistent databases. So CGIST breaks down the map of the United States by census tracts. Communities in CGIST are considered disadvantaged if, 1, they are in census tracts that meet the thresholds for at least one of those burden categories that we will look at in a moment, or 2, if they are on lands within boundaries of federally recognized tribes based on 2010 census data. For the purposes of Brownfields grant writing, you'll already have an idea of what area you're looking in. For certain grants, you might know the exact address that you're going to. Others, you might start with a city name or a zip code. So for example, if I entered a Chicago zip code, this is what the CGIST map would look like. And I can click anywhere on the screen to see more information about the census tract covering the area that I just clicked my mouse. Census tracts will be, or disadvantaged census tracts will be in this grayish blue overlay color. And then when you click on a census tract, it will be outlined in this dark blue line to help you get a better picture of exactly what you're looking at. When you click on a census tract, this panel will pop up on the right side of the map. It's actually one long panel, but for the purposes of fitting it on the slide, I split it into 2. The top half of the panel has census tract information, and it indicates whether the census tract is considered to be disadvantaged, yes or no. It includes an explanation, and then the bottom half of the panel is on this right side, and it's got those 8 burden categories that I mentioned before. So any burden that we'll say their threshold is met will be highlighted in this blue with the white text. Any burden that hasn't had its threshold met will stay grayed out. That threshold is 90%. So we'll talk more about what that exactly means in just a second. But if you click those plus buttons on, like, for example, next to health, we click that plus button, we could see a lot more specific information about different health conditions that this tool is using to compile a conclusion about health in the census tract. So we could see, for example, the share of people who have been told that they have asthma in this census tract. So we will actually look at this in the CGIST tool and make it make a little more sense. Here we go. So we can go to Indianapolis. There we go. And so if we zoom in, we can see all these like gray blue overlays on the map. Those are all disadvantaged census tracts that this map has identified. So we can click right here. So we want to look at what's going on in this green space. This panel pops up. It's got your tract information, city, county, population, a little more detail on demographics, if you want to know more about race, ethnicity, and age. And then we have a yes, no, is this identified as disadvantaged? Gives us a reason this tract is considered disadvantaged because it meets more than one burden threshold and the associated socioeconomic threshold. I will explain what that socioeconomic threshold is in just a moment. These are burden categories that we just looked at on the slides: climate change, energy, health, housing, legacy population, transportation, water and wastewater, and workforce development. And any threshold that has been met is highlighted in this blue. So we can look at health. And these details will also be highlighted in blue if they are above the 90th percentile threshold to be considered a disadvantaged census tract. So again, the share of people who've been told they have asthma is in the 96th percentile in the census tract. Share of people 18 years or older who have diabetes, 99th percentile, et cetera. And all of these burden categories will have this and low income. This is our associated socioeconomic threshold that needs to be met. So if you recall, this tract is considered disadvantaged because it meets more than one burden threshold and the associated socioeconomic threshold. That's this low income right here. So in order for this health button to turn blue and tell us that this is a disadvantaged census tract, at least one of these, diabetes, asthma, heart disease, and the low income thresholds have to be met. And the low income threshold is at 65% instead of 90. So we are getting a yes or no out of this category, or out of this tool. And then why? There is some information on the page about US territories. The data that the US collects for Puerto Rico and other territories is a little bit different. Won't apply to any of these grants, but if you're curious, there's more information there. And then on tribal nations as well, we can see that there's some reasoning for why the group that made this tool decided to categorize tribes and tribal entities the way that they did. And if you're curious, you can head to this tool and click on those links. There's also a methodology and data page, and it'll give you a better explanation of what these burdens really mean, what's going into them. So for climate change, we can see that communities are identified as disadvantaged if they're in census tracts that are at or above the 90th percentile for expected agriculture loss rate, expected building loss rate, expected population loss rate, et cetera, and are at or above that 65th percentile for low income. We see the same kind of structure for energy, are at or above the 90th percentile for all of these problems, and are at or above the 60th percentile for low income. Same thing for health, housing, legacy pollution, transportation. Now, if we're looking at this and we're like, how are they coming up with these low life expectancy numbers? I don't understand how they could possibly know that. You can click on this link and it'll take you further down the page to explain where this data is coming from, what it means, and the responsible party for collecting this data. And again, not necessary for your grant, but if you're curious, this resource is available. Last thing on CGIST is the downloads page. If you would like, there's a community list data. You can download an Excel sheet that has every single community that is mapped in this tool and every single data point for that community that is in this tool. It's a little bit overwhelming, but if you'd prefer to digest information that way. You can download that sheet and organize based on communities that are applicable to your target area. There's a shapefile you can download, same thing, and then support documents if you have further questions while you're using this. So again, be sure to state that within your target area, there is a disadvantaged census tract as identified by CGIST Justice 40, or however you want to phrase it. Just make sure it's very clear that you have used this tool and identified a disadvantaged community as this tool defines it.
I have a question, Riley.
Yes.
So what do our rural communities do with CGIST? I'm looking at a couple of them, and because the census tracts encompass, large tracts of land and wealthy farmers, then those smaller cities are not really shown to have any issues.
Sorry, Beth, can you repeat that? I lost connection a little bit through there.
Oh, no. What I'm saying is, for the smaller rural communities, this is an issue that CGIST isn't a very good tool. And maybe this is even a better question for Matt. How are there ways they can compensate for that with their own data to get full points on criteria?
Yeah, Matt, if you want to hop in, that's fine.
So can you repeat that? Because I want to make sure I got the question.
My question was, in order to get the full score for criteria within a grant, how does a rural community handle that when the census tract data may not really reflect the issues, because there are large census tracts in the rural areas, but the smaller communities they really have issues, but it doesn't show up. Like an example is Oakland City. It doesn't show up as disadvantaged in any way. I was just curious.
Well, I mean, that I think would be going all the way back to your selection and description of target areas.
Gotcha. Okay.
And, if you're picking out, even if they're small communities, if you're picking areas of particular need as your target areas, then in these later sections, I guess you can use some qualitative descriptions to try to demonstrate need, maybe loss of populations. It's hard to say what is going to work because you're going to have to come up with something for each one of these things if you can't rely on the census tract data.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, and if for some reason any community has no data in here, or they don't think the data is accurate, they can always, it's better to state, we looked, we found nothing, or we looked and we found this, but we have other data from our county or our different mapper or authority that suggests otherwise. At that point, it's still very subjective. There's not a clear path, but that would be better than not answering this part of the question.
Okay, that's actually, both of you were very helpful. Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions on CGIS before I move on to EJ screen? Okay. Here we go. So as stated in those grant guidelines we've been looking at, applicants are also encouraged to use EPA's EJ Screen tool or other EJ-focused geospatial mapping tools to gain a better understanding of the communities that may be adversely and disproportionately affected by environmental or human health harms and risks. So CGIST will provide you with that yes or no if your community is within a disadvantaged census tract that the Justice 40 initiative is looking for. EJ Screen has some information that gets a little more specific, and you can work with it a little bit more and apply it to your responses. So EJ Screen is a nationally consistent data set that combines environmental and demographic data into maps and reports for public use. It's a great tool to get a kind of bird's eye view of populations that may be disproportionately impacted by environmental injustice. And it's annually updated and typically modified with more data points to become an even more useful tool. There are 7 built-in map layers that we'll start with: economic burden indicators, socioeconomic indicators, environmental justice indexes, supplemental indexes, climate change, health disparities, and critical service gaps. And since EJ Screen is a little bit more in depth, we're just going to jump right into the tool. I think it's better to just learn as you go on this one. All right. So when you first open the site, you'll see this blank map. I have it centered on Indianapolis for today, but you can hop out to different communities. We'll say in Indianapolis for consistency. Whoops. We got an address, a search bar over here for an address or a city, generally how you want to frame your search. And then we will first look at this maps tab. So these are those map layers I just listed, and we'll start with the environmental burden indicators. This is our environmental data in EJ Screen, and there are 13 of them: particulate matter, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, etc. And if you click on, let's see, Superfund proximity, this key appears on the right side with a red to white gradient measuring the percentiles. And if we click on this one, maybe, there we go. If we click on a block group, there we go. So we see this blue outline here. This is outlining the block group that I just clicked on. So CGIST measures community by census tract. EJ Screen takes it down a notch and goes to the block group within a census tract. So we see this text box pop up. Superfund proximity in this block group is in the 97th percentile, meaning that the people in this block group are closer to a Superfund site than 95 to 100% of the rest of the people in the country. And if we wanted to compare our Superfund proximity to the rest of the state, we can do that. You might have to refresh the map. Now we're in the 8th percentile compared to the rest of the state. There's some more detailed information in this text box. When you click on your block group, we see the demographic index score, which we will talk about what that means in a moment. percentile of people in this block group reporting low income, and percentile of people of color in this block group. So environmental burden indicators, that is our environmental data. Socioeconomic indicators, we can think of this as our people data. And one of the cool things about EJ Screen is that you can look at information, just data points as it is in these block groups, or EJ Screen also has these indexes that it calculates. So the demographic index, this button over here is super helpful. It works. Okay. It's not super visible. On your screen, it should be. Mine is just a little misshapen. But the demographic index is a combination of percent low income and percent minority in that block group. So we're not looking at one issue at a time. We're combining them and seeing what the economic burden is here. You don't need to know the calculation. You don't need to explain. You don't need to explain what it means in your application either. Reviewers understand what the demographic index is, so don't worry about that. You can just say demographic index in this block group is blank. There is also a demographic index. And if you were to click on this button, it will tell you that it is a combination of unemployment rate, limited English speaking, less than a high school education, and low income. So it's another intersectional view of some of the socioeconomic data in here. So a way to apply this information, let's say you are applying for a grant and your community has a community revitalization plan that prioritizes assessing and cleaning up properties to make way for new business. If it's an area with high unemployment rate, let's say, you can talk about how cleaning up space would make space for new business, new job opportunities for people in the community, and elaborate on that further. They have environmental justice indexes. So this is showing where that environmental data we looked at and the people data we looked at come together, and burdens are disproportionately high and intersecting. So we can see those same 13 environmental burdens that we looked at the start. But now, if you click on them, Superfund proximity again. Superfund proximity, man, this thing is not very legible. There we go. Superfund proximity EJ index combines the environmental burden indicator for Superfund proximity with the demographic index, which is what we just looked at. So this view is percentile low income and percentile people of color with respect to Superfund proximity. You can do the same thing with other, come on. With other environmental burdens as well. And again, these equations are not something you have to remember. You can simply state the environmental justice index for Superfund proximity. So a way to apply this, we could, actually, let's look at the supplemental index first. Supplemental indexes are very similar. It's an environmental justice index, but we're looking at different socioeconomic data with respect to ozone for this one. So this combines the environmental burden indicator for ozone with the supplemental demographic index, which is those 5 factors that we talked about earlier: low income, persons with disabilities, limited English speaking, less than a high school education, and low life expectancy. Those 5 factors with respect to ozone levels in the air. So if we want to apply this, let's say you're applying for a grant that the target area overlaps with a block group that has a high percentile of lead paint under environmental justice index. You could talk about making strides towards environmental justice by assessing properties for lead paint, starting the cleanup and revitalization process in that neighborhood. You could apply it to all sorts of other environmental burdens as well in that same kind of vein. Then these climate change, health disparity, and critical service gap layers can be really helpful for making your case for funding as well. So we talked about, there were a couple questions asking about health and wellness or low income, things like that. So we can look at the climate change map, extreme heat perhaps. And your target area is somewhere that's extreme heat is in the, I think it's this 40 to 60 group. You could say, you know, if you know that in your community revitalization plan, there's a goal of improving green space, you know, you're cleaning up a site that's going to turn into a public park, and that would improve extreme heat burdens. You can also pair this information with the environmental burdens up here to further your case if you'd like. There is also the option to add your own data layers. So a map link or a shapefile, if that's something you have. Additional demographics, it's a little more complicated than you probably want for these purposes. If you want to measure by, there it was, congressional district or like zip codes or federal lands, you can do that. And then there's also a couple extra data points that are pretty cool to look at. EPA regulated facilities. This will be like our Superfund sites, pollution sites, or I don't know what's up with my computer today, but if I were to scroll down a little bit, we would see that this also measures where other brownfields are. Community landmarks, if it is relevant to your application, schools, hospitals, places of worship, etc. And then the last thing I want to go over is if you want to get in and get out of this tool and you know exactly where you're targeting, you can drop a pin or draw an area, and you have the option to download the EJ Screen Community Report. This will take all of the data from those 8 map layers that I talked about at the start and put it into one sheet. So you can save this to your files, know where your data came from. We see those EJ indexes we talked about. You can see compared to the state, compared to the nation, how this community is doing. All right, do we have any questions on EJ Screen at this point? And I can't see the chat, so if there's anything in there, I would appreciate if somebody could help me out there.
I don't see any questions.
Great. Okay. How are we doing on time?
We're doing fine on time.
Okay.
You can take another couple minutes for sure.
Okay, great. I just have a couple more things I wanted to touch on. Come on. The differences between CGIS and EJ Screen, just to recap. CGIS is really meant to give us that yes or no, help us identify the communities that fall under that disadvantaged community definition. So it's giving us that yes, no, and a why. And EJ Screen is mapping all sorts of other factors, and the data is left up to much more interpretation and application. So it just gives us insight into which communities are receiving funding via that Justice 40 initiative as well. CGIS uses census tracts. EJ Screen scales it down even more to block groups. And EJ Screen is great for that screening, outreach, analytical purposes as it applies to your community and what you're trying to do with this information.
I have one question. So between CGIS and EJ Screen in the grant guidelines or in the grant section on environmental justice, is it either or if you get, beneficial information, either or of these two, or does not having your community in a CGIS yes or no, or a yes community, does that automatically drop you down to just 2 points out of that section? I think that was what Beth's concern was, is that it's great for urban areas, but for your rural areas where, as she suggested, one or two wealthy farmers completely offsets the balance of the actual economic situation of that community. You might have the community itself is really, really disadvantaged, but a couple guys outside of town, which are part of the census tract, skews that terribly. So that's why I'm asking, does that automatically mean if you don't have a CGIS yes community, are you automatically drop those 3 points? Because in today's world of competitiveness in these, that pretty much excludes you from getting an EPA grant at that point.
Right. It's a really good question and a very valid concern. Since it's an initiative as part of an executive order, it's tough to work around because it is directing how some of our funding is parsed out. It is going to be a case-by-case basis, honestly. If I can't say a definite, if you do this, but you don't have a CGIS disadvantaged community, you'll be fine. There's no guarantee, but I think the best thing you can do if you're in that situation is acknowledge that there's, CGIS identifies it this way. You know because you're the community expert that this is really skewed data and you have data to back it up. You're putting yourself then in a better position for reviewers to consider that a little bit further than the black and white yes and no.
I guess from my standpoint, I could certainly understand, much like when they had opportunity zones as a requement, where if you didn't have it within an opportunity zone, okay, you lost a point. I could see that here. I just think the emphasis that they're putting into the point count on this is debilitating for a community that has issues, but they just don't happen to fall into that specific census tract that is listed as a CGIS community. So yeah, I guess it's a little frustration, but it is what it is. I wish they'd review that and kind of reallocate the points the way they should be.
Yeah, understood. It's a very valid concern. Do we have any other questions or comments before we want to move on?
There's none in chat.
Okay. Matt, did you want to say something? I see you're off mute.
Yeah, simply that, yeah, I appreciate the concern about census tract and appearing in CGEST. All I can say to that is that within our criteria that we are statutorily bound to, there is, discretion for each administration to use in exactly how to apply those. We are directed to give priority to factor in community need. Now, there are, many ways to evaluate that, and yet every administration has their own discretion to tailor those things, and we've had different administrations with slightly different takes on that. And I suppose if you wanted to, you can make an argument that sometimes it's more fair in the past than it has been to communities now, that it benefits some types of communities over others. All I can say is this is well within what statute allows us to do in setting priorities for grant funding.
Thanks, Matt. Anything else before I move on? Okay. This is a lot of text on the slide, and I know we only have a couple minutes, so I will paraphrase here, but this is a paraphrased example of a grant response to the question, identify the sensitive populations within the target area, the severity of those health or welfare issues experienced, and how this grant will address those or will facilitate the identification and reduction of threats to the health or welfare of such groups. I won't read the whole response. These slides will be posted, so if you want to take a look later at the specifics, you can come back. But I will tell you that some of the pros in this response, it's a great level of detail. There's a lot of data, and clearly the writer has used some environmental mapping tools to back up their response. The sensitive populations are very clearly identified, so the reviewer knows exactly what kind of issues are going to be addressed here. And the severity is explained in detail, again, with this data. The main drawback here is that it does not discuss the extent that the grant will address threats to the target populations. We get one sentence at the end that just states funds will be used to address these issues, but there's not a lot of elaboration as to how the community will address this second part of the question, and how the grant will address or facilitate identification and reduction of threats. One more example, the question here is to discuss how funding would advance environmental justice and minimize the displacement among underserved communities in the target area. Some great things about this response. We see very clearly new jobs, employment opportunities, and green space are some of the environmental justice issues that can be advanced. And new tax revenue and reinvestment are also mentioned. The drawbacks here is that primarily the applicant did not provide detail on how they plan to specifically minimize displacement in that target area, again, missing that second half of the question. And unless it was mentioned in an earlier response, which is entirely possible, there's no mention of a CGIS disadvantaged community, which, as stated in the grant guidelines, does dock a couple points. So at the end of the day, you all are the experts of the communities you're working in. CGIST and EJ Screen can give you information to work with, but it's your opportunity to take that information and apply it to what you know about your communities and what exactly is happening there. The most important part is to be specific about the EJ issues in your community and use your knowledge as the community expert to apply that and explain in the application your need for funding and how these issues can be addressed with funding. So thank you all for your time. If we have any questions, I can take them, or my email, my phone number is right there if you want to send them directly to me so we can keep moving with the workshop.
That was great, Riley. Thank you so much. I love the examples at the end.
Yeah.
Very helpful. All this information I think is very helpful for those that are.
One other thing I did want to mention, I don't know if you guys have provided the link to it, but on the EPA Brownfields site, there are FY24 successful applications, or granted applications that are listed on the site. And if you want, you can, I don't know if those are going away when the FY24 guidelines are announced, but if you want, you can download a couple of those applications, compare responses to this section, and pull out some that you think are a really good example.
Okay. All right. Well, are you still sharing the screen? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Here we go. Yep.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. We're going to talk about the Tab Easy tool for EPA Brownfields Grants, getting started with the basics. I just wanted to go through this. I've been giving this presentation a little bit different slant, and I think it's helped for people to understand why this tool is useful. In my past, I wrote grants. I use this tool all the time. It was so helpful. So next slide, please. It's free to anyone, and it provides helpful tips and resources. It covers all the grants that are available this next round, which would be the Community-Wide Assessment Grant, the Community-Wide Assessment Grant for Tribes and States, Coalition Assessment Grants, Cleanup Grants, and RLF grant applications. It also helps provide you for each grant the narrative information sheet, the narrative ranking criteria that you fill out for your narrative, and the threshold criteria. So let's get started. This is the web page. If you go to www.ksutab.org, and you get a little bit different than what you're seeing here, but you get the idea. You go to the main page, you select eTools. Now, if you haven't already, you will need to create an account with KSU Tab. It's your information. It's private. We don't have access to your information within this tool. And also, we don't use your information for anything other than sending you reminders for events like these if you're interested. So anyway, you go to eTools, and if you see towards the right side at the bottom here, that's kind of the opening. You see my grant applications are welcome to Tab Easy. How do I start a grant application? The red arrow there. Now go up to the red arrow towards the gold little tag there, start a new grant application. So that's how you get started. Next slide, please. And here we go. What you're going to do is you're going to select the type of grant. There's a drop down that gives you choices on the type of grant. Then you name it. It could be any name you'd like, but you do that, you save that and continue. Next. So here is what you get once you set that up. You get, you want to start your application configuration. That's really the very first thing you have to do. And I've got a slide here next for you to take a look at. Next. And this is the application configuration. This is important. What it does is, for one, helps you with your eligibility status, just to double check. And in this case, I filled out the screen with a funding amount for a coalition grant, $1 million. I selected who I was, the eligible entity, a regional council. I also answered that I did not have an active EPA Brownfields assessment grant. And if you do, there's options there. And then no non-lead member has an open Brownfields grant or was awarded a MARC grant that closed 2015 or later. Save that configuration. Next slide, please. And so here you see, once I do that configuration, what I'm going to get to your left, and sorry, I know these are busy, but I was trying to show the flow. But if you look to your left and you see the purple ribbon, that's your grant content. That's what you'll be filling out. So it shows the narrative information sheet, the narrative ranking criteria, threshold criteria. So what I've done in this case, I selected threshold criteria. You then get a drop down of all the criteria that you need to fill out for the coalition assessment grant. And that's on the right. Next slide, please. In the event you haven't looked at all of the grants that are out there, threshold does vary by grant. Narrative criteria varies by grant. All of this, it varies, so it's very nice to have it laid out for you in the order that it is in the grant guidelines. And right now we still have funding year 24 up. We won't have funding year 25 up until they're posted by the EPA. So it takes us a week or two to update everything, but by then we'll have everything updated for the grants you're applying for. Next slide, please. So here then I've selected narrative ranking criteria just to give you an overview of what you'll see with that. Next slide. And here this shows you, I selected to the left in the purple ribbon, the project area description. I then selected overview of brownfield challenges and description of the target area. And that's where you see, at the top, you see the criteria, overview of brownfield challenges and description of target area. Then next, immediately after, is evaluation criteria. So you don't have to thumb back and forth while you're looking for, okay, this is the criteria I respond to, but this is how it's evaluated. And that keeps everything very easy. Then we also have helpful hints, which I'll show you in a moment. But you put some text in like I did here, and you save it. Or you save and complete, and there's a difference. If you save it, that means, and if you look to the purple ribbon to the left, it's half filled because I have text in there. Now, the text in here is rather nonsense, so it's not complete, but this shows you how you go through. The little bubbles are either fully filled or half filled, depending on the status. But you always save, and if you want, save and complete. Next slide, please. And here we have then, after the overview, the criteria, the evaluation criteria, we also then have those helpful hints. And so these are things, just little reminders, thoughts that might help you as you're filling out the criteria. Next slide, please. And then you can export what you have to Word and print out your draft copy for review. Now, a lot of times what I've done is I've exported to Word just the outline alone, just so I have the outline and know what I'm tackling here. And that's pretty important. I thought it was very helpful too, because a lot of times criteria changes from year to year, and you may not have, you need to have the correct outline. Next slide. So that was pretty quick and dirty. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Well, then we'll get started with the panel presentation. And we're doing, today, we're doing sections 3 and 4 of the grant narrative. I'm starting with section 3, but I have my great panelists. That would be Matt Didier, John Morris, and Len Hendricks from BCA. And they'll be giving comments as I go if they see something they need to comment on. But please put your questions in if you have any. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this section really is all about those tasks. And here is the ranking criteria. And look at that. Task descriptions are a very important part of your application. Don't underestimate it. And cleanup, if you look, that's 55 points. That's a lot of points for this. So be very, wary of what the point spread is. Next slide, please. So section 3 is really about what are the tasks? What are you going to be doing? What's going on? Then implementation. How will you be conducting these tasks? Then the schedule by the second quarter, by the end of the second year, etc. The lead, who is going to direct that task? Who is leading the tasks? And it really, a lot of times what I've seen in grants that I've reviewed, the QEP is leading everything. Well, that's really not realistic, and it's scary if your QEP is leading all of the tasks, which would include procurement. So these are things to consider. And outputs, quantifying. What are you going to do once you do these tasks? What will you complete? Next slide, please. And here are some typical eligible tasks. Program management. Most of that time, that is the grantee doing the procurement, doing the EPA reporting, the financial and records management, progress meetings. For assessment, think inventory, site selection, community engagement, your phase 1, phase 2 investigations, cleanup and reuse planning, and then coordinated planning around your target sites. Assessment here must be for coalition, develop an area-wide plan, conduct market feasibility studies, evaluate infrastructure needs. And then cleanup related could be cleanup and reuse planning, community engagement, cleanup oversight, site cleanup. And then all grant types, you can have 10% of the award for health monitoring. Administrative costs may not exceed 5% of your cost. Next slide, please. Proposed cleanup. This is for cleanup grants only. So you have to, there's going to be evaluated on the quality and reasonableness of the proposed cleanup plan. A lot of times people just, when they want to discuss the plan, they just reference the ABCA. And that's the analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives needed for a cleanup grant. That's not enough. The other things to do now, ensure that your phase 2 is completed and complete the draft ABCA, because that sets the stage. That sets the stage for the community engagement, community notification, which you should start really anytime now in letting people know what you want to do, particularly with cleanup grants on sites, just so that they have an idea. Hey, this is where we're at. This is, we want to let you know, since you're the residents surrounding this area, we want you to know that we'll have these activities going on, and we are going after a grant to get that done. Project ahead to anticipate changes in cost And wow, I'd like to ask Lynn while we're in this. Lynn, have you noticed changes in costs for laboratory and drilling, that type of thing?
Yep. Ever since COVID, things have been kind of escalating along with all the other inflation, to be probably in the last 4 years over double in a lot of cases. Not necessarily the lab costs, theirs have gone up just a certain percentage, but certainly drilling costs have gone up immensely. Supplies have followed suit. So yeah, it's, the typical phase 2 that may have cost $25,000, $25,000 years ago, is now in the $35,000 range or maybe even more. So, plus new emerging contaminants like PFAS have kind of jumped things up pretty high too, because the analysis for those and the collection techniques a lot of times are quite expensive.
Yeah. So it's good to project ahead to anticipate the changes in cost. And I do think that John's group, Indiana Brownfields Program, might be able to help you with ranges of cost, because they have between the assessment phase 1s, but also then they do more of the phase 2 assessments and the tank work. And so hopefully that is a help. Another way that you get a good feel for cost, if you're a regional council, ask one of the other regional councils in your area, because Southeast probably wouldn't be the same cost as Northwest Indiana, but still just try to ask around. Same with cities, towns, counties, nonprofits. Start talking to people, and please reach out to Tab. We can certainly help you. We can find contacts for you to talk to about cost.
I have a question, Beth.
Oh, absolutely.
The question is the 5% cap on administrative separate or inclusive of the cap on indirect?
It's inclusive. I want to verify that with Matt.
Yes, any indirect costs that you claim, and any direct admin costs that you want to take cannot add up to more than 5%. And if you want to take indirect costs, which I would say few applicants ask for, go find where your organization has already negotiated an indirect cost rate with some federal agency, because that's going to be the most effective way for you to document and defend indirect costs if you want to put them in your application. As long as we're on the topic of these things, think about how much you want to include for your admin costs. Every year, I get at least one grantee who, when it comes to negotiate the actual grant and work plan, wants to raise the admin costs above what they applied for. I don't know exactly why they do this. I think maybe after they get the grant and they start really thinking about what it's going to take to implement it, they think, oh, we're going to need more staff time to do this, and we should charge more for it. But, you've already competed your proposal based on your tasks and their costs. And you get evaluated on that. And it is essentially unfair to other applicants if we allow people who are selected to start changing the budgets that they successfully competed on. So I'd say when you're doing that section, try to give yourself a realistic thought about what it's going to take to do this. If it, and defend that. Give us, as it asks for, hours, rates for different tasks that your people are going to be doing. Defend that and, stick to that. I don't think there's going to be much to gain by trying to hold those administrative costs down at the proposal section, hoping that you can then raise them when you go to actually, write a work plan for the grant you will receive.
If I could step in here too, I was going to bring this up in a later slide, but since you brought it up, Matt, my understanding has always been for grantees and relative to administrative costs is that the more money that you put into actual assessments, actual site planning, actual remediation planning, et cetera, community engagement is viewed more favorably in the application process and the scoring process instead of having a large admin budget, taking money away from actual assessment. Is that an accurate statement?
I guess I might make it a little bit subtler than that. First of all, the admin's capped at 5% regardless.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that the staff of the grantee may do, like they might do, and rightly so, they might do all the public involvement work. They might do all the they might do all the public involvement work. That could easily, be a cost beyond the 5%. As long as that's defended, I don't see where that's going to be a negative. I mean, we allow a lot of expenditure for public involvement. I tend to think it's, a better part of the application if the applicant describes how they are going to do that rather than just say the contractor is going to run some public involvement for us.
That makes sense.
So, there are places where you can depart from that, spend as much as you can on assessments, but it's got to make sense and it's got to be described in the task description and your cost estimates.
Certainly. I mean, I guess in the past we've somewhat advised, especially municipal clients, that from our understanding is that they're not necessarily claiming as much admin costs as they possibly could, showed skin in the game from their standpoint. Hey, we have enough capacity to administer this grant, and some of this is in kind, an in-kind service, as well as the QEPs, putting that in writing, saying, this would be an in-kind service. But with the influx now over the last 2 or 3, 4 years of nonprofits, and especially a lot of nonprofits that don't have a staff of 50 people, that's where we've noticed more of a tendency to want to take advantage of the 5% admin, and not all take the full amount. But we've also seen where nonprofits have asked, like you're saying, they wrote their grant application under $1 amount and then decided to upgrade that later. I think when the reality reared its head that there might be more work involved in it for them than they thought. So,
well, and I'm in the camp of they have to consider program management, particularly the community involvement. For every piece in program management, you are managing the project. You're managing the inventory. You will be reviewing your site assessment reports. You will be conducting community outreach, community involvement. Sure, you can be supported by the QEP, but I really, it saddens me to see people put 0 in program management. I think you have to consider now, if you're, like you said, you have a staff of 50 folks and you're able to do that, that's great. But a lot of even the regional councils, they have huge number of counties to travel to for inventory. And so to be involved with your project, I think you should at least put some funding into it. But I'll go on to the next slide here. So project implementation. Here are some deficiencies noted in past grant debriefings, poor description of the task or lack of milestones. You need more detail on the contractual task, or you just have too many tasks. So identify your task, plan the details, adjust as you go. Next slide. And here's a description of task activities for this particular one, project implementation. It was something the QEP would be conducting. They have the activities to begin by the second quarter and continue to the end. I suppose that's realistic because you spend probably your first quarter pulling together the partners, the folks that you want involved in community outreach, but also you're doing procurement. If you've done procurement prior, that's great. You've got a step ahead, but you still have to get through some of the other tasks to get started. So the environmental consultant is managing all the technical aspects of the grant, but it is overseen by the project director. And here are the outputs. Next slide. So some deficiencies noted in past grant debriefings, and we're taking this actually from communities that have had their debriefing and then they come to TAB, because if you have an unsuccessful grant this go around, by all means, send it to us now, and we could probably point out or come up with some strategies to improve it, make it more competitive. It's just it's so competitive these days. But anyway, here are some deficiencies. The project schedule was too vague. Inventory can begin in the first quarter, but likely will continue throughout the grant. Include a specific schedule. Be reasonable about those early tasks. If a schedule of tasks isn't logical, that people might take a look at that. So anyway, research how long those activities take, draft your schedule. Next slide, please. Cost estimates. Here's some other thoughts. What's the source of the costs? Where did you get those costs? Provide the rationale. Maybe you just closed an assessment grant, maybe, and you have a good idea. That's great. But if not, where are you getting the cost information? Or unit costs can be in the wrong area. Break down costs per unit. Indirect costs aren't fully explained. So these are just things that you might want to pay attention to. If you have supply costs, identify the supplies. And of course, travel to the Brownfields conference. Itemize. Next slide, please. And here's another good example of outreach, community engagement in terms of the cost estimates. What did it cost? Very detailed here. Next slide, please. Now, I took this from last year's presentation from the EPA, because I just thought it was a great example. Gives you an idea of where things go. For last year was for community-wide coalition. I'll show you a cleanup example here next, but these are examples and kind of gives you an idea. So if you have questions, give us a call. And then if you look to the right, you see that these numbers, the totals have to match the SF 424 and SF 424A that you'll need to fill out. Next slide, please. And here's cleanup grant application budget example. There's a discussion about 50% or more of the estimated contract costs are for construction, then the cost for the entire contract belongs on the construction line. I just felt like this was such a great example, and I would never like to redo it. It's really very good. Next slide, please. So measuring and evaluating environmental progress and results.
Beth,
Oh,
I'm sorry. Could we go back
Yeah.
2 slides? I'm sorry. Yeah. So on here, there's a couple things that we don't often see. They're not necessarily bad, but they come with, I think, a caveat here. One is the other line. It says a subaward. What a subaward is a very specific thing. And if you're thinking about, I wouldn't encourage anybody to just, think, oh, there's a subaward in that example we saw, and that means we can just sort of give money to somebody and call it a subaward. So you really got to look out or find out when a subaward is appropriate, what it is, and how you have to, eventually explain how you're going to use that and how you're going to monitor the subaward. But if there is something you want to do via a subaward, then in your proposal, you really got to say what that subaward is going to, don't just say who it's going to, say what work it's going to accomplish. And I would go on and say how you're going to manage this subaward. Again, with participant support costs, this isn't as, I guess, administratively complicated, but, tell us what the again, I guess if you want to call it unit costs that you're estimating to get up to that. In this case, it's $10,000. As long as we're looking at this, a couple other things. The personnel line item, that is only for costs being that are being incurred by employees of the grantee. So you're not trying to, sort out your contractors' costs between what they're paying their people and what they're paying for drilling and everything. You're not doing that. Your contract costs cover everything that your contractor is charging you for. Same thing with fringe benefits, same thing with travel, same thing as supplies. If you're, if it's being provided by your contract, or then it just goes in that contractual line item. These other things are only costs being incurred by the grantee. That's it.
You're muted, Beth.
Whoops. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Very helpful. Next slide. And then the next slide. And this is evaluating environmental progress, results. Again, I think it's pretty clear here about what the deficiencies noted were. Lack of description of outputs, need to include outcomes in additions to outputs. but make sure you're looking at the guidelines for funding year 25. Some things may change, so this is just really referencing funding year 24. But you do want to identify quantifiable outcomes, and we can help you here at KSU Tab if you need assistance. Next slide, please. Oh, and this is an example of measuring environmental results. I thought it was well done in the numbers and how it was laid out. Next slide. And thank you. I'm passing the torch to Roxanne Anderson.
Thanks, Beth. So section 4 is the part of your narrative that covers programmatic capability and past performance. Next. Completing the final sections of your grant narrative might feel challenging as you near the end. We all can get a little worn down, but every part is crucial. Think of it as a resume showcasing why you're the best candidate. Highlight your team and key staff and emphasize your organization's strengths. Aim to demonstrate to the reviewer that you have the expertise and capability to see the project through to a successful completion. Next. The programmatic capability section focuses on demonstrating that your organization can complete the grant work within the specified timeframe. Although extensions are sometimes granted, reviewers are looking for evidence that you can achieve success without needing extra time. If you're concerned about meeting these requirements, you could consider exploring coalition grants, which may be a better fit, and KSU Tab can help you in grant strategy and trying to determine that ahead of time if you would like that help. This section assesses your organization's capacity to handle all aspects of the Brownfield Grant project, including programmatic, administrative, and fiscal responsibilities. You want to ensure that you have a well-organized team where each member has a very clear role, including someone dedicated to managing the financial aspects. For coalitions, you want to make sure to highlight the distinct roles of each partner and their specific contributions. Next. If you plan to acquire additional resources, it's crucial to outline your procurement process and confirm that you'll adhere to federal regulations. You can find the federal procurement guidelines fact sheet among the additional resources on the registration website. And if you have any questions during that process, again, KSU Tab is available. Next. So this is a strong description of organizational capacity and structure. The submission not only provides examples that effectively illustrate their capabilities, but also clearly states their ability to manage the programmatic, administrative, and financial requirements of the grant.
Roxanne,
Oh, yes, please.
can we skip back
Yep.
a section
Please.
to procurement?
This?
Yes. So starting last year, EPA began providing guidance, printed guidance on your procurement process. It's nothing new. It was just guidance on how you have the best chance of complying with the grant requirements that apply to all federal grants. I would find that, you can find that through our website, I'm sure, and use that as your, a way of framing your response here. Now, you're going to use your own procurement system. So if you're a city or a town, you're going to use, and you're going to say you're going to use your procurement system, but you're going to do it in a way that matches all these, you know, all the different items that you need to address and stay aligned with in that EPA procurement guidelines.
Matt, this is Amy, just to let folks know, and I'm going to put the link in the chat box. That's already loaded up onto the website for this webinar.
Okay.
Yes, the federal procurement guidelines I mentioned, yeah, the fact sheet is available. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Matt.
One thing that's also important is sometimes, you know, there are applicants who want to enter a contract before they submit their proposal. If you're going to do that, there is a place to, you know, you have to tell us in the proposal whether you've already secured a contract. And, you know, if you're going to do that, then you should describe in that section and again here how, you know, what features of your procurement match the this guidance that EPA puts out.
Nice, thank you. You can skip ahead. I think this is it. Yeah, sorry. The next step is to outline who will be responsible for executing the project. This specific example effectively highlights Mr. Robinson's dedication and experience with the community, as well as his extensive background prior to assuming his current role. Even if a key staff member has been with your organization for a very short period of time, you can still showcase their relevant experience, similar to a resume. This description not only details his experience with grant awards, but also emphasizes his support network, which brings substantial grant experience to the table. Next. This is an excellent narrative example demonstrating how the applicant plans to secure additional resources. Matt kind of mentioned a little bit of this, but the county clearly states their commitment to meeting federal regulations by retaining contractors in accordance with 2 CFR 200 and 2 CFR Part 1500. They effectively outlined their approach to promoting robust labor practices. They provided a brief resume of their partner that they plan on using and highlights their qualifications and detailed how that partnership will benefit the community as a whole. So they just kind of tied everything together and connected all those dots. Next. The past performance and grants and compliance with grant requirements section is crucial for demonstrating your organization's ability to manage the grant that you're applying for. If you have previously managed a brownfield grant, be sure to detail the specific outputs you achieved and your track record in meeting those deadlines. If you haven't held a grant before, discuss any other federal assistance you've received, highlighting your compliance with those work plans and schedules and grant agreements. Or anything that shows your capacity to be able to handle what you're applying for. Next. So Barberton here provides a strong example of effective use of brownfield grant funding by detailing their multiple awards, much like a resume. They highlighted specific outputs and outcomes, demonstrating their capabilities even amid the COVID pandemic. For instance, with their 2019 community-wide assessment grant, they completed 19 assessments across 12 sites. These efforts resulted in 22 acres being prepared for reuse, the creation of 39 jobs, and $3.3 million in private investment. Barberton's narrative here includes specific, measurable data rather than general descriptions. They also noted their flawless compliance record, stating that they have never had a deficient audit and they have consistently met all criteria and deadlines. So this is a really great example of kind of fleshing that out for the reviewer. Next. So for those who have not received a federal or non-federal assistant agreement, the city of South Haven is an excellent example of a community in that situation. The point values assigned to your application can vary based on your experience with brownfield grants or other types of grants and or your lack of experience. So I recommend emphasizing, like I mentioned before, any grant experience you have, a big one being a common grant of CDBG grants, as many communities overlook the value of that experience or that they have held them. South Haven effectively listed all of their awarded grants, and they included the amounts and the outcomes, very importantly, that were achieved from those grants, even though they were not brownfield grants. Next. So remember, you're not alone in this process. I know it seems really daunting going through all of these, but help's available. Next.
Roxanne, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
can you go back one?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, to South Haven?
Well, either of those.
Okay.
When you're filling out this programmatic capability section, there's actually three choices. There's had a brownfield grant, had another federal or non-federal grant, or never managed any type of grant. You must never choose that last option. If you choose that last option, you are prevented from getting enough points that you will need to obtain a grant. So if you click on this last option, you're essentially you're not going to be successful. So I would, if necessary, I would really look at those last three words here, non-federal assistance, and come up with any time some organization or some individual has given your organization funding to do something. I mean, I think a good example is a couple of years ago, we had a successful grantee. The organization was basically brand new. You wouldn't have thought that they had ever managed a grant, but they had gotten a grant to establish their organization, to get things started and set up. And that's what they used in this section. If they said, hey, we've never managed a grant from anybody to do anything, they could not have been successful. So, think really hard if you have to come up with some kind of assistance that you have managed.
Matt, I have a clarifying question on that. With the grants this year, they anticipate, half of them being allocated to those who have had experience and those who have not. Are you saying that if you're applying for a grant saying you haven't had experience with a brownfield grant, you still want to make sure that you're clearly stating you've had experience with non-federal grants?
Yes, you do.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that for everybody.
Yeah, you have to. Those two options offer you the opportunity to get the same number of points. If you click the last one, never having managed a grant, you have the ability to only get about half of the points that the other two choices provide for you.
Oh, that's hard. Beth also mentioned that there's a KSU tab has a template for procurement. So if you plan to conduct procurement prior to submittal of the grant, you can use that as a task. And then KSU tab, as I'll go over in a second, can also kind of help you go through some of your experiences or non-experiences as you see them to help identify potential funding that you may not recognize that you've even managed or held. Next. And next. So as I mentioned, KSU tab is a valuable resource. Our team has extensive experience. We can help you draft your grant proposal. We can address any perceived capacity gaps. Like I mentioned, our support can begin even before you start writing, providing strategic guidance to ensure you have a strong foundation for your proposal. We're available pretty much from start to finish. Next. As Beth went over, in addition to our excellent tool of Tab Easy, we also offer grant reviews. This is coming up. We encourage you to take advantage of this service for a second set of eyes, if for nothing else, before you submit your application. When you're utilizing the service, just trying to submit your proposal at least 2 weeks prior to the EPA due date so that the KSU staff can have time to get it back to you with substantial comments before you have to submit it. Next. So from here, we're going to get ready to move into group exercises. For those of you who can stay, I really recommend you do, especially since we have a really great presentation right after group exercises, tying everything together. I also want to take this time to remind you, if you've not already pulled up the survey to take at the end of the workshop today, please take some time to pull it up now so it's there and you remember, because that feedback is extremely valuable to us. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Amy Ursovich to discuss the group exercises.
Oh, thanks, Roxanne. Well, they're getting my slides up. I guess they already have them, but I think this is a really important point. So I want to ask a question of Matt again regarding the grant experience, non-federal grant experience. I know in the guidelines it typically says a grant the same size or a similar size as a EPA grant, Brownfields grant, but if someone doesn't have a whole lot of experience, like what you were mentioning with your particular example, and maybe they have a smaller grant, should they mention that as well and maybe talk about we're new, or, you know, we're just starting out in grants, but we have this and we've done this? Because I think it's a really important point to continue to pass on, and I will continue to pass this on to people that are writing grants.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the size of the grant.
Like instead of a $500,000 or $1 million grant, maybe they're new and they've received, say, a foundation grant of $20,000 or $30,000.
Yeah, if that's the thing you have to talk about, then talk about that. You know, it's what people are going to describe here is going to, you know, there's going to be a range. I mean, like bigger communities are probably going to have, even if they don't have a brownfield grant, they're going to have probably multiple federal grants. Smaller communities, maybe you have state grants, not-for-profits. You may well not have either of those, and you're just going to have to discuss where you have managed money donated to your organization. Maybe that other person didn't even call it a grant, but it was money that was given you to do something. Talk about that. I mean, you know, if you're in that situation, I would count that as a non-federal grant and leave it to somebody at EPA to sort through and say, no, this is not a grant. You know, don't try to make that judgment for us. Make your best case with whatever amount of money that you've been given to do something.
Great. Well, thank you so much, because that's a really good distinction, and something that we as TAB can pass on to folks that may have questions about that particular issue in particular. So,
I mean, really,
anyway,
I cannot overemphasize this enough. If you're going to pick that last option, you might as well not even write this.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's very, very good point to make. Thank you. Well, moving on to our grant writing group exercise. If you were here yesterday, same sort of rules or instructions. You've been assigned to a working group, and since Dana will do all her magic from TAB, you'll end up showing up in a working group in a few minutes, along with a facilitator. I think we're going to have 3 work groups instead of 4 this time, just because of a change in number of people. Each working group will review Section 3 narrative ranking criteria from the Barberton grant that we used yesterday. And keep in mind some of the really good information and hints that Beth and the panel mentioned during her presentation as you're looking at it, as well as looking at Section 4 and Section 5. And then what we'll do, the facilitators will give you amount of time to take a look and read on your own and kind of look at Section 4 and Section 5 and get this in your thoughts. And then the work group as a whole will discuss each point, each section's subsections for Section 3 and award points accordingly based on the group as a whole. And when you're reviewing, carefully consider how well the grantee does tying their story together. Yesterday, I had my group take a look real briefly, make sure you go through one. You probably looked at Section 1 already, just, making sure that that is flowing through the grant and they're not picking a different identified area to focus on or a different priority site. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we have Section 5 with the narrative review information. That's going to be your primary tool because that's what's telling the grant reviewers what to look for and what to consider. So you want to make sure that you're really in tune to that. Section 4 of the guidelines is what a grantee is going to use. If you're going to write a grant, and that gives you the exact language so you're very clear on what the grant, what you're being asked for in the grant guidelines. As I mentioned, you're going to be looking at the community-wide assessment grant application for Barberton. Next slide. Narrative should be clear and concise. Did the applicant provide sufficient detail? I think panels made this clear both yesterday and today. Don't leave any question unanswered. There just really aren't any not applicable, answers that are appropriate anymore. Provide data from the census, EJ Screen, CGEST, other data tools. So we've learned quite a bit about EJ Screen and CGEST from Riley this morning. And how they use that and other data appropriately, and make sure the applicant used sample formats, use the tables. If they don't want to use the exact tables, make sure they included all the information that is shown in the sample tables and the grant guidelines, that they didn't miss anything. And again, consistency throughout the proposal, make sure it flows. That is essential. Next slide. I think that might be the last. So it's going to be 40 minutes today as opposed to an hour. And we'll regroup, and each group report from each work group can be up to 5 minutes. And those on the panel and other experts can ask any questions during that time. So I think we're ready, Dana, to put everybody in work.
Okay. So there was 3 groups. I don't remember the group numbers. I'm horrible with that. I'm sorry. But we can start with our group, and I'm gonna, if you don't mind, Dana, I'm going to share my screen in a second, just so Kathy can report out using our form, and kind of go over what we determined. So yeah, this is what our group scored, which was a 39. Go for it.
Yep. So we gave a 19 for the top part, which some of the things we called out lack of detail on were in the community outreach section, they didn't really describe the target audience. In the key staff person, task activity lead, they didn't necessarily give a detail about why that staff person was qualified for the job. So those were some places we took points off. And also the performance period, they didn't have dates in there anywhere, or even years. So that was for, but we gave them 15 points on the, where was the 15 points one? Oh no, I mixed up my notes. Cost estimates, 15 points, and then 5 points on plans to measure. So most of our points off were in the deduction for lack of detail in the 3A sections. Maybe a little bit on unrealistic expectations for some of the outputs. We did have some discussion there about cross-referencing sections. Like, so if you have a lot of description of the key staff in section 4, can you cross-reference that to the task activity lead in 3A3? And how did we think reviewers might handle that? So cost estimate 5. Yep, that's pretty much how I feel like in the very last second of our call, we started asking more questions about the cost estimate, but we had given them 15 at first. So maybe that could have had more wiggle room later.
Can I say something about cost estimates real quick?
Yeah.
The group I was sitting in didn't get to it either, but that's the part of this section where the applicants distinguish themselves, differences in how well they do this. And what we're looking for is, I thought this applicant did a really good job. In cost estimates, places where I see mistakes the most commonly are if they have, say, for example, they have a task for community involvement, and they have and there's personnel costs in there. And say they come up with an estimate of the personnel cost. I'm going to go back to the task description and say, in the task description, did they say that someone from the city is going to be working on the public involvement activities? Same thing for the environmental consultant. If they've got cost for an environmental consultant in the cost estimate, then in the related task description, it should say, what the environmental consultant's going to be doing as part of that task.
Thanks, Matt. That's a really great point. I think that answers a few of our questions, but the other question, Matt, it was whether or not, can you reference other sections like, section 4 or section 2 when filling out one of these tasks, section 3, or is that dependent on the review?
For the public involvement, if you've written a lot about public involvement and what your public involvement activities are and who's doing them and who you're trying to reach, the reviewer will already have read that by the time they get to this task description. So they're going to have, a level of detail about that. Anything else I wouldn't really be referring to, although I'm not sure where you'd refer to anything else previous to the proposal, but
I was specifically
as a task.
I was specifically thinking about the task activity lead. So my task activity lead for community involvement is my natural resource planner who has a master's degree in communication and years of watershed planning, community outreach. I'm going to just put that in her task, in her biography in the key personnel. So can I say, this is the lead C43 for A or something, or do I need to put that information in again? Or
I don't think you need to refer to it really, or restate it.
Okay.
You should say, it's going to be,
Hmm.
the city's participation in community involvement is going to be someone from our team.
Oh, you think that's enough? Okay, because that was one of our
Yeah.
things we downgrade. Okay. So it's more going back to the budget. Who are we paying to do it on the budget?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And in that case, even you don't really even need to name an individual. I don't think
Hmm.
applicants typically name an individual. They might name, a position like our project director, our planning commissioner, or whatever is
Hmm.
responsible for this activity, and they charge out at X number of dollars per hour, and they're going to work this many hours on the grant.
Hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy.
Mhm.
Does the next group want to go?
Yes, I think that would be our group. Thank you, John.
Yeah, I thought it was our group.
Yeah.
We'll be number 2.
Yes.
We ended up, we only got through, I guess, the third task 3, and didn't get to the cost, but we ended up giving full points to the group, and we were aided by having Matt in our group. So, some of the things that we, at least I know that I looked at in task 1 community outreach, it would have been nice for them to document how, other than maybe just the meetings, how the technical documents may be available to the public. But that's not something that we dinged them for from a point standpoint. But one thing I've not myself, I guess, written a lot of these, but especially with a 10-page component. But I didn't know, Lynn, how much are we, when we score these, and I look to Matt maybe too, how much are you really fighting to compete against keeping it to 10 pages, so to speak? I mean, a lot of these tasks had necessary information, but appeared a little abbreviated, and I didn't know if that was just a casualty of trying to keep it to 10 pages or not. But overall, we scored the third group full points, 25 points.
You know what? Every year I am just thankful I don't have to write one of these. And I'm also very thankful that I don't have to read more than 10 pages for each of them. So
Honestly, I think the 10-page limit has been a good thing. I think it's kind of, for lack of a better word, forced applicants to be more concise and to think about the value of every word they put into them. I mean, it's a pain, but I think it makes them think more about really truly the value of what they're putting in there, and comparing it against the guidelines and the points and things like that, instead of, I mean, I remember when it was 18-page limits. I mean, you saw, miles of text and all sorts of stuff. And now it's definitely cooked it down to the basics. And I think it's a good thing overall. It can be a challenge for a first timer to jump into that arena because, in a lot of cases, they're used to expounding upon things, ad nauseum sometimes, but this sort of really forces you into being very concise and make sure that you weigh what you're saying, and is the value there to put that much text. So,
yeah.
and yes, John, it a lot of, I think, in this section, a lot of this is kind of cooked down pretty tight to single words or very short phrases to try and communicate what you're trying to say, but not pay the penalty in space. And I still, even in the example here, or I guess we'll get to that when we get to our group, but had some questions about the amount of space that they use to do these sections.
The only other comment, I guess, from our group that we had, even though it wasn't part of our evaluation of talking, we didn't score it, but looking at the tasks is for task 1 for the budgetary, is that sufficient enough detail for EPA? Looking at the community outreach personnel, 200 hours, an average rate of 40 per hour. I guess there's not specificity of how they're going to spend the 200 hours. I guess you could imply that it's for planning the meetings and having the meetings, but I didn't know if there was a additional detail that needs to be placed in here, or if you think this is sufficient for the purposes of scoring.
I think it's sufficient. I mean, you can walk back and see, you know, that city personnel is going to have some participation in the public meetings. You know, I don't know if it's, I don't think it would be reasonable of us to ask them to, you know, try to get specific about what that person's going to do, what they're going to have to do. You know, I don't know if they're going to know that. And then, you know, I think if it's in the bounds of reason, for the number of hours you're going to spend on it, then we will generally accept the applicant's estimate. You know, I have had sometimes when I thought, you know, they were putting crazy things in, you know, like they were going to review the quarterly reports prepared by the consultant, and they said they were going to spend like 200 or 300 hours over the course of a grant reviewing these quarterly reports. It's like that, to me, that would not seem reasonable. But other than that, I think we give, you know, a lot of leeway in these estimate of hours.
Okay.
Matt, can I ask a follow-up question on that? If so, like in my case, I would have to have fringe and indirect, and so then I have to describe my allocation costs, right? And do I have to describe my whole process, or just say I have a approved fringe allocation cost of this mop for this year?
So if you want to get that through by claiming indirect costs,
Yeah, I have to, because I have to charge all federal agencies the same. So I would have to
then
explain that in this, right? In here, I would have to have another section for explaining that.
Well, if you're gonna, I mean, in that line, I would say, you know, the indirect costs consists of these things. And if you're, if fringe benefits is how you're getting indirect costs, then I would, you know, then you should mention that in that section.
Okay. Thank you.
This is another thing. I've also had people come back to me after they get the grant and say, my organization requires us to get indirect costs out of every federal grant. It's like, if you didn't have it in the grant, I'm not going to allow you to put it in the budget. And if that means you won't accept the grant, then you know, that's on you.
I appreciate that clarification.
Thank you.
Beth, did you have any other comments, I guess, from our group too? I didn't have any other points
and
to say.
Because we were so brief with things, I just felt like it was a good conversation overall, even though we didn't achieve the what we were supposed to achieve. So thank you, John.
Oh, thank you. So I guess we're ready for group 3.
Oh, before they start, this is Amy. Just to let you know, Roxanne, we had a group. I had a group. I wasn't expecting a group, and I don't know if Len was supposed to be the facilitator, but anyway, Len will do our report out if you guys want us to go next.
All right, perfect. Yes, please do.
Okay.
So we dived into it, kind of went through, spent probably the bulk of our time on 3A, the description of tasks and activities. And I think we felt as a whole, they did a really good job of satisfying each of those independent tasks 1 through 4, or I through I4, 4. Enough detail. I felt like maybe they spelled it out a little lengthily at times. There was a little bit of what I would consider a space penalty there, but they got through it and they did it well. And I think we ended up awarding them their 25 points for that section. We got down to cost estimates. That's one of the things that Matt kind of alluded to here, is that if you read through their descriptions of their various activities, they have the QAP doing a lot of help to the grant manager or to the community on a lot of tasks, but then you get down to the actual cost estimate table, and under contractual, there's nothing for community outreach, nothing for site inventory, nothing for programmatic support, but yet they've been requested or specified in the task descriptions that they would be assisting with each of those tasks. So at a minimum, it would probably require, after they're awarded, maybe an adjustment of some of those contractual tasks, to put some dollar figures in there for them to assist with those things. So I think we felt from that standpoint that they fell a little short. And I can't remember, Amy, what did we decide? A couple, 3 points or something like that off that section because of it, or at least 1 point off that section. Am I correct?
Yeah, I took 3, but I think we were thinking 2 or 3. We were kind of in between. We didn't want to take too many and get them booted out of being successful. So
yeah, it's just they accounted for it elsewhere, but didn't backtrack it through so that it was accounted for in the actual cost table. I think we didn't really talk at length about their 3C, the plan to measure and evaluate environmental progress and results. But somebody might have had a comment about that, and I don't know if they want to chime in here about maybe not having some dates or some time frames in there. If that's the section that I'm thinking of that we talked about. Anybody want to expound upon that?
I'll just,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just saying, other than that, I think they probably achieved their 5 points for that section.
Yeah, I think we were kind of running out of time, and I said, well, how about 4 or 5? Because I think they did a pretty good job. So maybe 4.5 or 5 would be more realistic. Because they didn't, they did kind of talk about, that big timeline as making sure 35% of their grant was going to be expended, and that's within 18 months, which is a milestone. I know, for, as Len mentioned, for the brownfield managers. I think it was probably fine.
So I guess if you total up our points, 25 plus 5, that's 30 plus. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt, 13. So 43 out of the 45 points.
Yeah.
Seems reasonable, and it's probably in line with what they actually got, just because if they'd have lost more than 3 there, they probably weren't going to get awarded in 2024. So any other questions or anything? Okay.
We can move on to the next group.
Were there more than 3 groups? I don't think there were.
Okay.
Okay, we can put the slides back up. And I believe we're moving on to Amy's presentation.
Next slide. Oh, yeah.
I don't know where the best place for this is, but I did want to say, because I think people will probably use this as an example. There was one section, and we never covered it, where I think this applicant could have done much better. And that's in the leveraging section.
Okay.
And specifically in there.
I'm sorry, the slide we put in there was taken from an Indiana application. I didn't put Barberton up, but what was the example in Barberton?
Well, where I thought they could have done much better is they listed a whole bunch of grants which the city or the town is presumably eligible for. But what we're looking for, as well as some kind of list like that, is want to make an assessment of the availability of funds to, leverage the described work. My view is that list of grants doesn't say anything really about how or when that money is going to be available. It doesn't, it didn't say whether any of these grants had been secured. It didn't even say if the applicant had applied for any of these grants. So if you want to do well, in my view, in the leveraging section, you have to do more than just list out as many grants as you can that might be relevant to your project that you might be eligible to receive.
Thank you, Matt. Well,
Yeah,
Anne,
thanks.
are you ready?
Yeah. Good information for us to know. Thanks, Matt. So anyway, we're just going to tie all this together from the last 2 days. And as far as putting together a proposal, and, this is the narrative. We're not talking about any other portions of the grant. So keep that in mind, because obviously there are different things that you have to do. But this is really the creative part, or you're trying to be creative. Next slide. So this is the stage, and you'll see this. This is basically the stage that you do in section 1 that Betha talked about yesterday. You want to give a very good, detailed without getting like 3 pages or whatever, but give a good all around history of your geographic area, of that city or whatever you're calling your geographic area. I see a lot of interesting things like we were the first ones in this state to have the railroad come through. And as a result of that, these businesses sprung up, and over time this happened, and now we've got this particular corridor or area in decline. So make it unique to you. Don't be general, just be specific. Then you're going to boil down to that corridor or target areas, as we mentioned, as it's mentioned in the grant guidelines, and the affected population. Again, you saw where points can be taken off if you don't have a disadvantaged area, or a disadvantaged population that's suffering from a larger than average percentage of poverty and joblessness, education. You'll see oftentimes lack of advanced education, or even a lack of high school diploma. So things that are leading to problems that you're seeing there, just make sure that that's all covered. And again, add details, census data from EJ Screen, things like that. You want to be specific. Then you get into whether you're doing an assessment or a cleanup. In either case, cleanup, you can have more than one site, and talk about that. Assessment, you may have one or more priority sites. Don't do too many priority sites, or you can do more than one target area. Don't do too many of those. I'll talk about that in a minute. Just it just gets confusing and hard to keep a hold of. You want to focus on the ones that are most concerning for you and where you really want to spend this grant money. So then you move on, and then you're going to start talking about the positive impacts and the reduction of identified threats. And some of that is covered in section 1, but that also goes into a lot of what section 2 is about with regard to the sensitive populations and health and welfare and things like that, and how this is specifically, this grant is going to help you in those areas. So I guess the overall arching thing is provide good details and good census data, other demographic data, EJ screen, that sort of thing, and avoid generalizations like the plague. Next slide. So here's an economic renewal example, actually very much like Barberton. So you've got this lack of business opportunity in your target area. You have job loss. They had a recent business close. They've had businesses closed in the past. Failed industrial legacy. Barberton, like a lot of Northeast Ohio, flourished mainly in the steel industry and those supporting businesses, and now that is that has gone way down, and places have closed, and job losses just increased exponentially, and you can put all kinds of data to that. So we go to health and environmental impacts from that poor economy, and high unemployment and contamination. So you're going to have those impacts that if you've got high unemployment, you're probably going to have some health impacts. You're going to have other impacts from lack of maybe good access to healthcare, that sort of thing. So include all those details. Where you can do percentages, definitely do that. Then move on to abandoned manufacturing site, as Barberton did, is chosen as a priority site, and explain in detail why that is a priority site, or sites if you're doing more than one. No generalizations, put in good details, and where you're going to talk about how that priority site or sites, redeveloping it is going to improve the health and welfare of the residents. So those health problems, those maybe lack of access to good food or healthcare or things like that. The health problems they're experiencing, asthma or whatever. How is this going to help? And the more ties you can do back and from the problems of the target area to your redevelopment and how that'll help, the better. Next slide. Okay, common pitfalls to avoid. Waiting until the guidelines come out to start writing your grant or planning your grant project. You can outline your grant project. You can do a lot of planning activities, such as getting your partners together, letting them know what your project is, you're going to know what area of your city or your township, village, whatever, that you really want to get some money to help. So start thinking about and this is where you can be general, obviously. Look at last year's guidelines until the new ones come out, and start outlining your grant, outlining those details, looking at what statistics you're going to use, or writing them down, and that sort of thing. Get with your partners, let them know what you're thinking of doing, what's your priority site, how's this project going to work, and get them on board. Find out where they can help you, so you have that really good partnership going on, not only to help you as you go through this grant process, and people that you can maybe talk to or bounce ideas off of, but also use as your partners when you have to provide all those details in section 2. And as I mentioned before, too many priority areas, too many sites. It's pretty obvious. You get too many in there, and it's going to be hard to keep everything together, especially with all the details. As Matt mentioned, and I feel the same way when I'm reviewing grants every year, I'm like, I'm glad I'm not writing this. There's a lot of details that go with it. And the more target areas and sites that you have, it's going to be really hard to keep everything clear and flowing, and end up staying within the required amount of pages. So use a priority project where one of the things you want to avoid is using a priority project that, if it is redevelopment, it doesn't do anything to help either the targeted population, or it's somewhere outside of, the targeted population that you're really talking about that needs help. Writing too much up front and not saving room for other areas where points are usually lost. I would say look at successful grants as you're starting to outline this and see how they've done that appropriately, and learn from them. Ignoring the notes in section 5, the evaluation criteria, which we used in our group exercises yesterday and today. You really want to look at the grant guidelines and read them and know them very well, but you also want to see what the reviewers are looking at when they are scoring. So, make sure that you're looking at both section 4 and section 5 really well as you go through the different sections of the narrative. Non-cohesive story, incomplete response to criteria. We've talked a lot about that. Either there really are none, as Matt said, that you don't respond to in some way. But if you don't cover everything that it's asking for, you're going to lose points, and you may just lose enough to be knocked out of, competition, for a grant. Next slide. So different things to do your homework. I did put a link up if anyone wants to. It's at there's a document that I put up that has links to census data that is on the KSU tab webpage for this particular workshop webinar. And so you want to take a look at those, see if any of those are going to help you. I'm sure some will, and hopefully a lot of them will. State and local health departments. Some of the state departments, I can speak to Ohio because I'm there, they have really nice websites that give you really good health data, maybe even some other different data that is going to be for health and welfare that will really help you. Local hospital reports. I think Beth mentioned this, or if she didn't, talking to your local hospital, because oftentimes they're going to be doing reports. They got to know what kind of health problems they're dealing with in this area, because they have to staff appropriately and they have to spend and buy appropriately. So they're going to know some of this data. And then community health assessments or community health needs. This link will also provide you with some of that data, so that instead of county, there's a lot of county health data, and for a lot of states, you can drill down better into something that's a little more local or even specific to your target area.
Amy,
yeah.
I just want to add to that, because those reports are public, and you can typically find them on their websites. And it's very helpful for the more rural areas where, you have regional hospitals, but they have information on specific locations within those regions. So it's great for that data. That's all.
Great. Well, you're still on, Beth. Can you speak to Alice? Because I meant to ask you a little bit more about this, but I know this is an Indiana resource that you would know more about.
Yeah, it's more about those that are caught in the middle of being impoverished, to those that work and live on a shoestring, where they can't afford doctor visits, they can't afford insurance, but they're not really thought to be in poverty. It's really more about the households in an area and within regions, at least in Indiana, when I've used this, with counties, they actually break it down into townships. So you get a really good idea of, hey, how much is a housing in this area? Is this an extreme, is this an extreme issue for the families living there? It's pretty interesting. I mean, if you get a chance to check it out, I think it's worth your time. Great.
It does sound like it could be very helpful, and especially in rural circumstances. And then some municipal documents, transportation and planning departments. They often have an inventory of sidewalk existence and its condition, and probably most importantly, because everybody has to comply with this, the ADA compliance. Parks and Rec, park inventory, that's going to be very helpful, that you can, if your target area is underserved by green space, parks, that sort of thing, that's something that you definitely want to speak to and may want to consider as part of your project. Many applicants incorporate into their projects expanding some green space when they clean up a particular big site, or maybe connecting to a bike path, things like that. Next slide. KSU tab. We do draft application reviews, and I know a lot of maybe some of you, and definitely a lot of people take advantage of that during grant season, and we're glad that you do. We provide, we review them, we do edits, comments, suggestions. It's about a 3 to 5 day turnaround. Usually as you're getting close to the deadline, it might be a little bit longer because these reviewers, which I'm one of, get bogged down with a lot of them. So do try to schedule in advance if you can. Again, it's an extra set of eyes. Even if you're working with a consultant, and a lot of them do really good jobs with grants, it's just something that I might catch that somebody else didn't catch, or that sort of thing. So the more eyes on it, the better. Can provide second review if time allows, and we do have that happen. If somebody gets us to us early in the review period, we can often do that and help you out that way. Next slide. Okay, next steps and key milestones for your grant together. Next slide. Identify the funding that's right for you. We have, if you're looking at assessment grant funding, which quite a few people are, the majority of people are, you need to make sure that you as an applicant are eligible. If you're a coalition, you need to make sure that the lead applicant, is eligible, and who's going to be in their coalition, and make sure that you're all on the same page, get together on the same page as far as what target areas, what areas you're going to be focusing on, what is your overall objective, and with this grant, and everybody agrees with that, and that can be all along with other other types of needs can be memorialized in a memorandum of agreement. So each person's or each applicant's role and responsibilities. Identify priority sites, establish a reuse plan, engage the public before or after. And Beth mentions that we want to review FY24 guidelines. I think I do get to that, but thank you, because I'll mention that. It's always good to mention it more than once. Look at last year's guidelines, and now that they're on EPA's webpage, US EPA's webpage, take advantage of looking at some of the successful grants. There's also some on KSU's webpages too. And make sure that how everything's going to work with grants.gov. If you haven't done this before, I highly recommend that you get with another community, and you can always call us at KSU. US EPA may know, or your state agency may know other successful grantees that might be able to kind of help you out with that. So they can kind of get you through and know when you need to do what, when, so you aren't stuck at the 24th hour trying to get this into grants.gov and have all kinds of problems. The other thing is, if you only have a couple sites, you don't have a whole targeted area, or maybe you're just so new to this process as a township or a community or whatever, that, you really would, kind of like to get your feet wet before you get into all the, everything that's required to put a grant like this together, there is federal targeted brownfield assessment. There is a link on there to the contact that you have for Indiana, Melanie Sorman. So do check on that, because oftentimes they can help you with assessment work. Some states do have assessments. They'll do a targeted brownfield assessments as well. And what's nice about these types of assessments, federal EPA or the states that have them, is they already have contractors on board. Their application process is pretty simple. They're going to make sure you're eligible. And then they're going to make sure that you have site access. That's always the big thing. But you don't have to do a lot of hiring the contractor, doing reporting, that sort of thing. A lot of this is done for you. So you get a sense of what the assessment and getting into the brownfields process is like before you apply for a grant, in this particular round.
Amy, just a quick note. Even if you go through TBA, we're not going to get your site access for you. You're going to have to do
yeah. That is very true. And, it's the same at state level when they offer them as well. We're not going to do that. That's really important that you get that site access. That's usually that can be the big stumbling block if you've got some problems there. So next slide.
Amy,
Sorry,
John Morse, Indiana Brownfields Program, has resources as well for assessment.
Okay.
I'm not sure about the timing for the grant now, but this is something to keep in the back of your brain. If you don't have an EPA Brownfields grant, please reach out to John and his team. They do wonderful work, and I know. Thank you.
Yeah, and John took himself off mute. He may want to add a comment or two.
Yeah, I was only going to say that our POSI funding's available for any type of petroleum work and sites that we have going on right now. But for our assessment money or our cleanup money and our 128A bill, we're almost, I think, kind of obligated for everything we got right now, and we're just kind of getting sites lined up for future funding.
Yeah, great. So call John. Anyway, I think we're on to the next slide. Cleanup grant funding, again, determining applicant eligibility. We've talked about that a lot. Usually contacting folks like Matt at US EPA is the best way to go with this. You can also contact state if you have state contacts, and John in particular for Indiana. If there's anywhere in the Indiana Environmental Agency that is doing any type of enforcement action, that's going to be a problem. So site eligibility and as well as applicant eligibility, but particularly site eligibility is very important to establish there. Make sure you've got a phase 2 completed. We talked about that. You do have to have the state environmental agency write a letter that you have done sufficient assessment to do the cleanup that on this particular site. Again, this gets down to discussing the site with the Indiana Brownfields Program, developing a community outreach plan. As has been discussed the last couple of days, you need to have a public comment period. Make sure that you've got that. There's timing involved with that as far as when the public comment period is, having the public meeting, taking attendance, getting notes from this, and having your application and APCA, which I'll talk about in a minute, in a public area where people can assess them, usually a library or something along those lines.
One thing about the cleanup grant threshold, in addition to talking about, talking through us with your site eligibility, pay real close attention to all the public involvement. Too often I've seen applications from applicants who have done a lot of public involvement in the past regarding the site they're applying for or the area they're applying for. And they think that covers the public involvement that they need to do to apply for the grant. And it does not. We have very, very specific steps that you have to take. Part of the reason that we have that, I think the main reason we have that, is that it satisfies the it basically satisfies the requirement to do an environmental impact statement for all grants that give, for all federal grants that involve construction. So if we didn't do this at the proposal stage, then everybody who gets one of these cleanup grants would then have to go out and do an environmental impact statement before they could spend any of the funds.
Thanks, Matt. That's another I wasn't aware of, but makes sense. And another reason it's so important to get those follow in the grant application guidelines, you know, exactly what the timing is and what is required for, you know, your public noticing and public meetings. Just do not miss any of that. If you have questions, I'm sure Matt and his staff can probably help with that. You just don't want to, you know, slide by that, because that could just kick you out and disqualify you from the get-go. Develop a solid reuse plan. If you have a developer that has already decided that this is what they're going to put, maybe you have some type of agreement that they're going to purchase the site after, and they're going to do this particular development. Whatever you have documentation wise, or that you can refer to, they can't look at those documents, obviously, that indicates that you have a solid reuse plan, you know what's going to go there, is the best, because you're at the end of the road as far as cleanup is concerned. As far as the cleanup process is concerned, you've done your assessments, now you're doing your cleanup. Now it's what we call shovel ready for the most part. And when EPA reviewers are reviewing and deciding which one of these are going to, you know, get awarded, maybe all the grants, everything they've written looks really good. But one of the things that's going to make a big difference is if A has a solid reuse plan and B does not, A is probably going to get funded, because they know at the end of the day, the objective of the EPA is to make sure the site gets redeveloped and is benefiting the community. So getting that redevelopment done is important. Start drafting an analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives, or also known as ABCA. There's an example here. There are other people that have done those. I'm sure John might want to speak to this, or even Matt, you know, that can help you with this. But essentially, if you're not familiar with an ABCA, it's looking at some different ways to clean up the site. So there might be various alternatives, as it indicates, and one of them being not cleaning up that site. And then they're going to go through the pros and cons of those various alternatives, including costs. And that way, you know, it gives, when you're doing your public noticing and public meetings, it gives the community a good way of knowing what has been considered. Why are you, you know, going with this particular type of cleanup versus another?
Hey,
Yeah, I get an old cleanup grant and see what the ABCA and that, a successful cleanup grant, and see what the ABCA and that is. The ABCA format is real specific, but not real detailed. I mean, they're all pretty much the same. They're not super detailed. And it's not just a good idea. You know, it has to be done as part of your public involvement process. You have to get that and the full grant application out to people for the fully required public comment period.
Amy, we are going to have to wrap up here soon. We're at the 12:48 mark.
Okay. Let's see what we have in the next couple slides. Do you want to advance, Dana?
I believe that's me.
That's it. Excellent. I was thinking that was the last one. So thank you very, very much. Here's our contact information as far as us at Kansas State University tab. And we really appreciate you being here today. And if you were there yesterday, there as well. And Roxanne, myself, and Beth are around for questions. You can email or call us. If anything we talked about wasn't clear or you want more information, we're glad to give it to you. Do we have some closing slides, Roxanne, or probably just, yeah.
Yeah, so you can do next, Dana. Once again, I'd like to encourage you to please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation for this event. You can scan the QR code on the screen or click on the link in the chat box. Your feedback is really important to us, and it helps us understand what was most helpful to you all and how we can continue to offer beneficial programming like this. Next. So just again, thank you so much for participating today. You can find this recording on your registration website, as well as more of our contact information and all of the additional resources that we talked about and went over today. If you guys have any additional questions, please just reach out to us via email as we are at time. And thank you so much for attending.